Welcome to Jason Learning. I'm Patrick Shea. I'll be your host for today's STEM Career Role Model event. And our guest today is Emma Cotter. She is an ocean engineer and is currently a postdoc at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Emma uses acoustic instruments to study the twilight zone of the ocean. She's helping us better understand what lives in this relatively unexplored part of the ocean and how it interacts with other parts of the ocean and global ecosystem. We're going to learn more about her work and her career path, and we'll be asking some questions that came in from students out there that were submitted in advance of today's recording. So without further ado, I just want to say welcome, Emma, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks. Great to talk with you all today.
So let's start with kind of the basics. You're an ocean engineer. How would you define what an engineer is, and why did you decide to be an ocean engineer of all the types of engineering out there?
Yeah, I think what is an engineer is really broad. Engineers use all sorts of different tools. There are biomedical engineers, there are environmental engineers, but what I do is using unique tools to study what's going on in the ocean. So sort of right on the edge of science and engineering.
And how did you come to be part of the Twilight Zone team at WHOI?
Yeah, so this is a project that I'm relatively new to. I started in September of 2019, so I guess about 7 or 8 months ago now. And I previously had worked on nothing like this. I worked in a much more shallow environment, studying marine renewable energy. So looking at how we can use renewable energy devices like wind turbines in the ocean to extract energy. But in doing that, I'd used a lot of acoustic tools and worked with really large data sets, trying to find answers in these really big data sets. How do we analyze them? And so that actually ended up being a really translatable skill set to this project that I'm working on now, looking at the Twilight Zone, where again, we have really big acoustic data sets and we're trying to figure out what does it all mean? How do we get the interesting parts of this data? But it's definitely a problem that I'm also pretty new to.
And how would you describe your role as part of that team?
So I'm a postdoc, which is a position that's usually a temporary position after you finish your PhD. So I was in grad school for 5 years, and now I'm in this position for probably 1.5 to 2 years, where I'm learning. I'm an independent researcher, but I'm also working under someone else, still sort of developing my research skills and learning a lot while I'm doing it. And so then after that, I'll hopefully be in a more permanent position where I'm more in charge, I guess. As we just discussed, I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, which is on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. But before I dive into talking about my research, I figured I'd give you a little bit of a background on how I ended up where I am today. So I grew up in Cranston, Rhode Island, which is where I went to high school. And when I was graduating from high school, I knew I was really interested in the environment and I was really good at math and science. So I decided when I went to college at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland that I wanted to study environmental engineering. At the time, I pretty quickly realized that what I was the most interested in was, at the time, renewable energy. So I changed my major to mechanical engineering, and which led me to pursuing my PhD at the University of Washington, studying marine renewable energy. So I was working in a group that was studying wave energy and tidal energy. And that's sort of how I started working in this ocean realm. And in doing that, I was working on developing monitoring tools for if there is a turbine in the water generating renewable energy, how does that interact with the environment? How are there interactions with marine mammals and fish that we need to be concerned about? So I started using sonars and cameras underwater to look at these things. And that's what led me to working at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, working in an entirely different ocean environment, the Twilight Zone, which I'll get into in just a second. All right, so what is the Twilight Zone? This is just sort of a big picture figure of the different regions of the ocean that we talk about. And as you probably know, the ocean is really big. It covers about 70% of our world. And the region of the ocean where there is sunlight, the epipelagic zone, or the sunlight zone as we call it, is really just that first top layer of the ocean, and there's a whole lot that goes on under it. And so the region that I'm talking about today that I'm really interested in is the mesopelagic zone. So this is just beneath that sunlit zone where it's not completely dark. There is a little bit of measurable light, but not enough light to support photosynthesis. And so there's some really interesting life that occurs here. And the Twilight Zone is relatively unstudied. We've only been able to actually study about 1% of all of the mesopelagic zone. And as a volume, the mesopelagic zone probably makes up about 20% of the total ocean. So it's really big and we don't know a lot about it. But what we do know is that most of the organisms in the Twilight Zone form what we call layers. So there are these really relatively dense layers where there are a lot of organisms concentrated. And a lot of those organisms migrate up to the surface every night and then back down during the day. And this is actually the largest migration on Earth. But the reason that they do that is because they can go up and feed in these surface waters under cover of darkness. So things like marine mammals that use their sight to hunt have a harder time hunting for them. And we know that there's a really significant amount of biodiversity in the mesopelagic zone. There are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of species yet to be discovered that live in this region of the ocean. But here you can see just a few pictures of different organisms that have been discovered in the mesopelagic zone. You can see that there's some really interesting looking organisms that have all different sorts of crazy adaptations to live in this environment. A lot of them bioluminesce or produce their own light. And we have all different sorts of gelatinous organisms like jellyfish or siphonophores that can grow in chains to be tens of meters long. But for the most part, the organisms that live here are really quite small. And so one of these is, just as an example, the bristlemouth, which is a type of fish predicted to be the most abundant vertebrate on Earth. But it's really small. It's less than 3 inches long. But there are so many of these throughout the mesopelagic zone. Another type of fish is myctophids that live in the mesopelagic zone, and over 200 different species of this type of fish have been found. And as you can see, again, these are really quite small fish. Many of them bioluminesce, and they have these really interesting colors and adaptations. So this is cool. There's a lot of interesting organisms, and there are a lot of them. But why do we care? Why are we pushing this big project to study this right now? Well, that vertical migration of so many of these organisms actually makes them a biological carbon pump. So these organisms are migrating up to the surface and then going back down and doing things like digesting and pooping. And that means that they are carrying the carbon throughout the ocean. And that means that they're an important part of how the planet regulates carbon in the atmosphere, which we all know is really important. These smaller organisms are also a food source for larger organisms. So they're relatively close to the bottom of the food chain in the ocean, but changes to the bottom of the food chain are going to have cascading effects moving up. And because we don't know a lot about the Twilight Zone, there are a lot of big unknowns that remain. One of these is, how does the vertical migration affect the carbon flow? And how many organisms are there? How do they behave? What types of organisms migrate? How many of them don't migrate? Do they migrate every day or just every other day? And what effects does all of this have on the climate? And so if we were to remove some fish from the Twilight Zone, what implications would that have for carbon in the atmosphere? And the reason that this is a particularly pressing question right now is not only because of everything going on with climate change, but because of increasing demands for fish and depletion of fish stocks throughout the ocean, there's been a lot of talk about starting to develop fisheries that fish deeper in the ocean and actually start removing some fish from the Twilight Zone. So if this is going to be done, we need to understand if it can be done sustainably, how many fish can be sustainably fished, and how can we regulate this if it does begin to occur. And just a couple of articles that have recently been published on this topic. We're not the only ones who are worried about this. This has kind of been sort of a big question that's been popping up in news sources around the world. So I've told you that there's a problem, but how do we actually go about starting to study and understand and learn more about the mesopelagic zone so that we can answer these big important questions? Well, there are a couple of tools that we can use to do this. The first is net sampling. So this is just what it sounds like, dragging a net through the water, catching organisms and looking at what you caught. Next is optical sampling, or using cameras. And this is a great way to get really high resolution information without having to bring animals to the surface. But it also means when you're operating in an area that doesn't naturally have light, you need light, so you can't see over very long ranges. The third is sediment traps. So this is capturing the sediment that's carrying carbon throughout the ocean and looking at how it's moving through the ocean to get a better idea of that carbon flux that I was telling you about. And finally is using acoustics. And this is what I study personally, and I'll get into a little bit more detail about that in a few slides. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about net sampling and then get into more detail about acoustics, but I'm not really going to touch on these other two methods today. So as I said before, net sampling is just what it sounds like. It's dragging a net through the water, bringing it up to the surface and looking at what you caught. But because you know how big your net is, you can come up with an estimate of the volume of water that was sampled and come up with, well, there are this many fish per this unit volume of water, get an idea of the density of organisms that you're seeing. And so this is really the only way that you're going to get to look at what's inside of these fish, do dissections, measure exactly how long they are. And so it's a really, really valuable tool. These are just a couple of pictures of organisms that have been brought up in net trawls during this Twilight Zone project so far. A former postdoc named Paul took these photos, which I just think they're really awesome, so I wanted to put them in here. But there's one big challenge with net sampling. Not only can you obviously not net sample the entire ocean, but like most things, most fish don't really want to get caught. And so avoidance ends up becoming an issue. You're not actually catching all of the fish that are in that water that you're moving your net through. And a recent study that came out a couple of years ago said that actually this effect might be bigger than we thought before. And maybe you're only catching 1/10 of the fish that your net is moving through. And that effect of fish scattering is going to change by the type of fish. So the bigger fish might be better at avoiding the net. And you start to have all of these different convolving factors coming into your estimates of how many fish are in the mesopelagic zone. So how can we get around this? One way is by sampling remotely. So instead of actually putting a net in the ocean, having an echo sounder on the ship that can look at the whole water column. The way that this works is an echo sounder on the boat emits a pulse of sound that travels through the water. And when it bounces off of something, it's reflected back to the ship where there's a receiver. If you've ever been on like a recreational boat, you might have seen a fish finder that looks like this. It's really the same concept, only these echo sounders are calibrated so that we can get more scientific measurements out of them other than just where are the fish. And so the data from one of these echo sounders looks something like this. And so this data on the x-axis here, we have the time of day, and on the y-axis is the depth. So the surface is at the top, and we're going down to about 800 meters deep here. And in general, where you see the brighter or more intense color is where there are more or larger fish. So you can see that layer that I was telling you about, where there's an intense layer of fish. We frequently call this the deep scattering layer just because of this reason, because it's scattering so much sound. And in this, you can also see where there are organisms in the evening, at the beginning of the night, going up to the surface, and again in the morning, coming back down to that deep scattering layer. And just an interesting anecdote is because this creates such a strong signal in the water. When ocean researchers were first using echo sounders in the ocean, and they saw this layer, they initially thought that it was the bottom of the ocean because they just couldn't imagine that there would be such a strong amount of life happening in these deep depths. But it turns out that it's this rich habitat. And so studies like this using shipboard echo sounders have been conducted all over the world, and we can learn a lot of information from them. So here's just a study that came out a few years ago that shows data collected in different parts of different oceans. And you can see that there's some pretty significant differences. And so from this, we can get an idea of when in the day do organisms migrate, what fraction of the organisms migrate. You can see here in the East Pacific, seems like basically all of the organisms are migrating, whereas in the North Atlantic, which is where the data that I just showed you is from, a smaller portion of the animals are migrating every day. But actually going from this type of data to an estimate of how many fish are there in the mesopelagic zone is pretty complicated. And there are a few reasons for this. So when we have an echo sounder that's coming from a ship that's on the surface and we're looking over really long ranges, you're not going to see individual fish. You're looking just like a camera when you're looking from so far away at a fish school, you're not going to be able to make out individuals, but we're seeing the fish all in a group together. And so this means that we need to make some assumptions about the fish that we're seeing to come up with an estimate of how many fish there are. So this number that we measure using our echo sounder is called volume backscattering. And it is essentially a function of how many fish you're seeing and how much sound they scatter. So the same number of volume backscattering could be observed if you're seeing a lot of little fish or just one bigger fish. And so you need to make some assumptions about what organisms you're seeing in order to understand this information. And on top of this, for most fish, many fish, what the part of the fish that scatters the most sound is what's called a swim bladder. And this is a gas-filled bladder inside of the fish. And because it's filled with gas, as the fish goes down in the water column, for the same fish, that gas bladder is going to change in shape and volume because of the increasing pressure. And so that means for the same fish, the amount of sound that it scatters might be different depending on where it is, what depth it's at, especially if it's migrating. This becomes a bigger issue. And on top of that, we know that many of the fish in the mesopelagic zone, but we don't know how many of them, don't have swim bladders. And not all of the organisms in the mesopelagic zone are fish. There are crustaceans, there are gelatinous organisms that are also contributing to this backscatter that we see from the surface. And finally, on top of all of this, for any organism, the backscatter that you see is also a function of the frequency that you're using to measure. And so for a fish, the backscatter is a function of the frequency of the echo sounder that you're using, which you can think of just like the frequency on the radio in your car that you change to get different channels. So the target strength as a function of frequency for a fish might look something like this. For a crustaceous animal with a hard shell, it might look something like this. And for a gelatinous organism, it might look something like this. So you can imagine that if my echo sounder that's on my ship is operating at this frequency or operating at this frequency, you're going to see different organisms and might come up with entirely different conclusions. And we can see this. That data that I just showed you was collected at a frequency of 38 kilohertz, but you can see data collected at the same time from an 18 kilohertz, so a lower frequency transducer. And you can see some significant differences in what we observe. And that's because we're seeing different animals with these different frequencies. And so all of this is really complicated. And using these shipboard echo sounders, it's a great way to be able to see really far and image the whole water column at once. But we need to know more in order to interpret the data. And so in order to address those challenges, as a part of this Twilight Zone project, engineers have developed a system called DeepC that has echo sounders on it, but instead of them being on the boat, this system actually travels down into the mesopelagic zone. So we can look at individual target strengths. We have concurrent camera data and data from other sensors, so we can start to paint a better picture of what's actually going on here. And so this is just a sort of a blown up picture of what this system looks like. And on it, we have echo sounders that span a broad range of frequencies. We have a multi-beam sonar, which gives you a little bit more, it's an acoustic instrument, but it gives you something that looks more like an image. We have a holographic camera that images a three-dimensional volume of water. It's a really cool instrument. Another camera that images a sheet that's illuminated by lights that's about a meter by a meter in front of the system. An eDNA sampler, which collects water samples, and then people are able to look at what DNA might be in it and get an idea of what organisms might have been there. And environmental sensors that tell us the temperature of the water, the salinity of the water, and how deep the system is. So these are just a few pictures of testing of the system before it was deployed. As you can see, it's really pretty big. It's not something you can just kind of throw over the edge of the boat. And the system has been out on 2 cruises so far, so one in the summer of 2018 and one in the summer of 2019. And so we're still going through these data and both refining how DeepC works and using the data that we've collected to start to answer those big questions that I was telling you about. So these are, again, just a couple of pictures from those cruises. I believe these pictures are from 2018. And we're planning, hopefully, to go out again in August with this system. Once again, we've learned more about how it works and more about the specific questions that we want to ask. So collecting more data this summer. So that's all that I had for today. Here's my email address if anyone has any questions.
So thank you again, Emma. That was a fascinating overview of the work that you and the team are doing with the Twilight project. The Twilight Zone project. I guess where I would start is why has the Twilight Zone region been so poorly explored in the past?
I think the biggest reason is because it's really hard to explore and it's really big. There's just so much of it. And so figuring out the right instruments and the right questions to ask is challenging. And with these more, the methods that we're using where we're actually putting systems into the mesopelagic zone, that's going to help us answer a lot of questions, but isn't necessarily how we'll be able to study the whole Twilight Zone, right? We can't tow DeepC through the entire ocean. And so figuring out how to extrapolate these things and get big answers is really challenging.
Is it, if we were to make a comparison to say like remote sensing via satellites, is DeepC kind of the equivalent of spacing on the term now, ground truthing?
In ground truthing and understanding what assumptions you can make and what the implications of those assumptions are.
And do you have, I know it's still pretty early, but is there early results that have helped you understand the data that you were collecting before, or how to make changes for the future?
Yeah, so one thing that I've been working on is actually comparing, we have data from the shipboard echo sounder and we have that data from at depth. And so doing a direct comparison of the 2 data streams, which has been interesting because when you make the right assumptions, the data lines up really well. we're able to get the same results from the system that's at depth and the system that's on the surface. But that means you need to know what the scattering of the organisms you're seeing is. And so we're still thinking a lot about what is the right way to handle all of this information and what does it mean for sort of the global picture. But one thing that we are finding is that some of the estimates that have been published for how many fish are in the mesopelagic zone are probably pretty high. We think that the actual number might be quite a bit lower.
Interesting. So as I mentioned, we've got some questions that students have about what your job is like. You've kind of provided a lot of context for us on understanding the work that you do, but what is your work environment like? What's your kind of day-to-day experience doing this kind of job?
Yeah, lately, like a lot of people, as you can see, my work environment is more of a home kitchen. But when I am in the office, a lot of the work that I do is on a computer sitting in an office. So kind of rotating between fieldwork when you're out collecting data, which, because I'm relatively new to this project, I actually wasn't on any of those cruises that we mentioned. So I'm really excited to go out this summer. And then coming back and spending months or years analyzing that data, understanding what it means, and using that information to figure out when you go out again, what would you change? What new information do you want?
And what kind of tools do you use to do that work? And I guess we can talk both about tools, and I'm really interested about the process that you go through. Like, how do you tackle a big data set kind of problem? And how do you think about it? Like, what are the skills that you need? What's the mindset that you have to do that successfully?
Yeah, so I actually, a lot of my background is in using machine learning to address just that question of, we have a massive amount of data, and having one person sit and click through it is not feasible. That's just not going to work. And so how can we analyze that data more efficiently and maybe more accurately? And so the first thing that I did when I started, and again, when I started in September, I was working with an entirely different instrument than I'd worked with before in a different environment. And so looking at little bits of that data to understand what you're looking at and what you want to pull out of it, and then working on designing automatic processing or machine learning to emulate what you would have done as a human if you were going to actually sit down and look through 24 hours of data. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Is visualizing the data, it looked like there were some standard ways of representing the data that the echo sounder is collecting as graphs. Is that kind of the standard and the expected way of seeing that? Or can you get creative? Is there a benefit in getting creative about how you're visualizing the data that you're analyzing?
I think there's definitely benefit in getting creative. And those figures that I was showing, they're what we call echograms that have the time and the depth. And so those are good when you are actually looking at the data as a human, trying to pull out different pieces. And it's always important, no matter how much automatic processing you have, to look at the data and make sure that everything makes sense. But when I have 24 hours of data showing individual targets, putting it on one plot like that isn't really going to work. And so that's when we start to come up with different metrics that show how many targets did I detect at different depths? How can I represent that information and kind of compress this information into one figure? And that's a lot of what all scientists do, is what do I want to put in the figure that shows my results.
And can you talk a little bit more? I know machine learning is definitely a hot topic. I know a lot of the students out there are very interested in career opportunities that might leverage machine learning. Can you, again, just talk a little bit about the underlying components? What are the things that you would need to be good at to successfully apply machine learning to a problem like understanding the echo sound data?
Yeah, so
Is it mostly math? Is it computer science? Is it a combo of all of those? Or is it really just kind of being able to get your head around big data sets to begin with to understand how to ask questions about it? Or all of the above?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. There's so many different aspects to it. So there are people who are actually working on developing algorithms to do machine learning. And then there are folks who are more using those algorithms to do science or to answer their questions. And I'm more on the side of using the algorithms and really appreciating the people who develop them. And so on that side, I think the big questions that you need to answer, when I first started doing it, I was like, oh man, the math of it is going to be the really hard part. But that turns out to be pretty easy to figure out. And there's programs to do it for you. You're not writing code from scratch to do it. There's a function in just about every programming tool that people are using. But what is hard is figuring out both what training data, right? You need to train your algorithm to give you the output that you want. So what does the data that you're putting in look like? How do you format it? How do you get it? How do you annotate it as a human? And then when you look at the results, what metrics do you use to figure out if it worked well? Because you could use one metric that says it was perfect, but then look at another metric that says, actually, no, it's not. And so figuring out what metrics are appropriate for your application is something that I've spent a lot of time doing.
And because you mentioned the training data, that I assume would have to be data that you're highly confident, or at least fairly confident, is showing whatever's true about the world out there. How do you develop that sense of confidence about that training data set?
So for the work that I did previous to this, working in an entirely different application, that data was generated by sitting and looking at sonar data and as a human annotating what we thought it was. And so in that application, the algorithm's never going to do better than the human. It's going to have some of the same biases that a human might have built into it. You can get around that by maybe having 10 people annotate the data and taking the average of what they said or something like that. But there's always going to be, when you have a human annotating data, that there's going to be issues with it. And you just can't do better than a human necessarily. With what I'm working on now, I've actually been trying to use models from physics to generate what I expect the scattering from different organisms to look like, and using that as training data. So essentially using synthetic data to train my algorithm. And that's something new that I'm working on and still figuring out if it works, but a pretty different approach to generating it.
Cool. The reason that we've connected with you is that we've done a couple of projects funded in part by Office of Naval Research. They're really interested in acoustics and wanted students to learn more about waves and how they're applied. Obviously, the way that you're collecting the data, it's all based on sound waves. So are there other ways that you use different types of waves in your work? Or is that's kind of the big one of all?
Yeah, so I guess with acoustics, we usually divide it into active acoustics and passive acoustics. So active acoustics are what I'm working with right now, where you're generating a sound and then using that to make guesses about what's around you. So I'm looking at how the sound that I generated comes back. Passive acoustics is also used to study the ocean, and that's listening. So that's putting a hydrophone, which is sort of an underwater microphone, in the water and listening to sound. So depending on the question, that sound might be, are there whales making sound? It might be, how are the rocks being moved with the tide? So how much sound is there from sediment moving? All different sorts of questions that you can answer just about the sounds that are happening in the ocean independently.
Um, as somebody who's kind of new to this area of research, what's been the most interesting thing from your perspective, or the biggest surprise?
Um, I have really enjoyed learning a little bit more about the biology of these different organisms. There's just so many interesting adaptations and bioluminescence, and just seeing the pictures that come out. I've always been much more on the engineering side, and looking at acoustic data, which is really interesting and really important, but you don't get those, incredible pictures of a jellyfish. And so just being able to be more in touch with that side of the research and learning more about it and the different methods used there has been really interesting.
In general, what would you say is the most exciting thing about what you do?
I think fieldwork has to be the most exciting part for many ocean researchers. It's when you're actually out there. It's entirely different than when you're working in the office because you need to make decisions quickly. And if you don't, collect the right data, then you don't have the right data. You can't just do it again the next day usually. And so in some ways it's can be high pressure, but it's just really exciting and a lot of fun.
What are some of the biggest misconceptions about what you do?
I think a lot of people are surprised that my degrees are in mechanical engineering. They're maybe less so as kind of there's more and more research in different areas happening. But people tend to think like mechanical engineering, cars. And so people are surprised that there is an environmental side of it. There's people doing biomechanical engineering. There's just so many different pieces. And I think that that's something that folks have been surprised when I've told them.
And what are some of the biggest challenges you face in doing your work?
I think in working with acoustic data, there's always this challenge of, it's not a camera. You can see over long ranges and you can not have light, but there always need to be assumptions about what you're seeing. And so figuring out what the right assumptions to make are in any application using acoustics, and what you can say from the data, I think is an interesting challenge that kind of pervades all of the different problems that I've worked on.
All right, we're going to transition now and go back in time. And I know you talked about this a little bit in your presentation, but our audience out there, I'm sure, would love to know kind of how you got to where you are today. So, at whatever point that it makes sense to start, like what were you like as a kid, and why do you think you ended up doing the kinds of things you do now?
Yeah, I wish my answer to that question was I grew up in the ocean state. I always loved the ocean and I ended up doing ocean research. That's kind of true. I've always loved the ocean, but it wasn't quite such a linear path. I initially wanted to study environmental engineering. And I think environmental engineering is really interesting and important, but it focuses a lot on sort of larger scale questions like pollution or water quality or air quality. And I was more interested in developing systems, and especially in the question of renewable energy. And that's a field that I think I'll probably end up coming back to in some way. And so when I did my PhD, I applied to a whole bunch of different programs that were engineering programs and had research going on related to the environment. And so again, what still wasn't like laser focus. I want to do ocean acoustics. And so I think everything worked out pretty serendipitously. that I ended up doing what I am now because I really love it. But I think it's also important to say that, I wasn't the sort of person that when I was 10 knew exactly what I wanted to do.
We interview a lot of people, a lot of STEM careers, and there are definitely some that go directly from point A to point B and know exactly what they want to be when they're 10. The vast majority are saying things like what you're saying, that they don't know. And so everybody just needs to keep on exploring out there. Were you always interested in math and science? Did you always know that was going to be part of it? So that wasn't always part of the solution.
No, and I think I always kind of thought I was bad at it for a while, even though I got good grades, and just never considered it something that I would do until pretty late in high school. I thought I always sort of had this environmental focus and thought maybe I'd go into environmental policy or politics. And pretty late in the game changed my mind and realized, what I'm actually getting the best grades in and enjoying doing the most is more the math and science side. Even if I've told myself that's not what I'm interested in. And so it was late in the game. It was after I'd already started applying to college that I put that all together and haven't looked back. So,
was there a particular moment, or was this just kind of a gradual realization?
I had really good math and science teachers my senior year of high school, so I think that helped. I think also growing up a little and thinking more about what I liked versus what was cool to like was part of it as well. But yeah, I don't think there was necessarily one light bulb moment.
You mentioned a couple of times an interest in renewable energy. And is that something that you'd like to get back to? Is the acoustics and the ocean acoustics kind of part of that path, or do you see those as two separate things?
Yeah, so I'm hoping to, at least as part of my research portfolio moving forward, have some going back to the marine renewable energy, something that I really enjoyed working on. I really love the community working on it. And there are a lot of environmental questions surrounding that, or questions surrounding how can we use, like if we have power in the ocean and we can power an echo sounder or an ocean observing platform for a long period of time, what sort of science can we do? So I'm really interested in those questions. But I think at this point, more of what my sort of niche is working on large data sets in the ocean, figuring out how to handle them, regardless of what the question is. So I've enjoyed getting to work on a couple of different big questions.
We covered up maybe a little bit of this when we were talking about machine learning and how you deal with those big data sets. But were there skills or mindsets or talents that you developed along the way that you didn't realize were going to be applicable to the work that you're doing now, but now looking back, you say, oh yeah, that was really handy to have in my toolbox when I got to this point and needed it?
Yeah, I mean, at this, data science is really a whole field at this point, which is something I didn't know going into grad school, and took some classes in the area, did sort of an incubator program where I was working with a data scientist for a little while, and that helped me develop some of the language even to find relevant tools, understand what tools were out there. And so that was definitely part of sort of growing into the position that I'm in now.
And again, another question about challenges. Were there any big obstacles that you had to overcome to get to where you are now?
I feel like I've been pretty lucky in terms of the I had a great advisor in grad school who was really supportive, and again, have a great advisor during my postdoc, which has made a huge difference. Having that support, someone who's, you know, going to help you and advocate for you. I've been really lucky with that. So I don't think I've had any huge challenges other than, you know, getting a PhD is never easy, but definitely been lucky.
What other kinds of jobs have you had along the way?
So I went straight from college to grad school. So not a whole lot. In college, I did a couple of internships. I interned at the Environmental Protection Agency one summer, and that was in more of sort of a water quality type position. And I also did a summer research program at a different university than the university I went to, something called an REU, or Research Experience for Undergraduates. So I lived in St. Louis for the summer and did research in a lab there, which I think was really good for me to figure out that research was probably the right area for me. But then, yeah, right after undergrad, started grad school.
So transitioning again, looking ahead to the future, what do you see? What comes next? Obviously doing the postdoc now. Where do you go from here?
Currently thinking about jobs at national labs. I think that for me would probably be a good fit. And yeah, that's I guess currently the goal. Though I'm also thinking about jobs at universities as well, but still kind of sorting that out.
And then also kind of with an eye towards the future, what kind of advice do you have for students that might want to follow in your footsteps, that have been inspired by your story today?
I think don't be afraid to try something different, even if you're not sure that it's, the right thing for you. It's okay to change your major or do an internship that ends up not being exactly what you wanted to do. Try different things, especially while you're in high school and college, because that's when you have the chance to just do something for a few months and then do something totally different. It'll help you figure out what to do next.
Great. So I'm just looking at the clock, and we are actually have gone a little bit over an hour. So I think maybe as a last question, is there anything that you wish somebody had asked you today that you didn't get a chance to answer? Or any final words of wisdom for our students out there?
Not that I can think of right now.
Put you on the spot, right?
Yeah. But I think if you're interested in going into science or engineering, just know how many different options there are, and those options might not be immediately obvious, but you'll find the right thing.
Great. Well, thank you once again. This is all the time we have. Really appreciate you sharing a story about your work and your career path with us today. We also want to say a quick thanks again to the Office of Naval Research and our partners at EBEC in Rhode Island for making today's program possible. And once again, for Jason Learning, I'm Patrick Shea. Appreciate everybody watching today's event, and we'll see you next time as we learn more about STEM careers.
Thanks so much, Patrick.
Thank you.